Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
Welcome. I'm Professor RJ Starr. I'm thrilled you're here today because we're diving into a topic that everyone, and I mean everyone, can relate to. Why people annoy us. Think about the last time you felt irritated. Was it a stranger cutting you off in traffic? A coworker oversharing during a meeting? Or maybe even a loved one chewing a little too loudly at dinner? Irritation is one of those emotions that sneaks up on us, often over the smallest things. But as trivial as it might seem, it holds a surprising amount of psychological depth. In today's episode, we're going to explore what's really behind those moments of annoyance. We'll look at the psychological and even biological roots of irritation, why certain behaviors get under our skin more than others, and most importantly, how understanding this common experience can lead to personal and social growth. Because let's face it, annoyance is part of being human, but it doesn't have to control us. Now, before we dive in, I want to set the tone for this conversation. This isn't about pointing fingers or judging ourselves for feeling annoyed. Instead, it's about curiosity and understanding, two qualities I'd argue are at the heart of psychology. Along the way, we'll touch on some key psychological concepts, like emotional triggers, cognitive biases, and even the role of projection in our relationships. And don't worry, we'll balance the academic side with relatable stories and practical insights. My goal is to make this as engaging and thought-provoking as a chat with a good friend, albeit one who's also a professor. As we move through this topic, I encourage you to reflect on your own experiences. What are the little things, or big things, that tend to push your buttons? What did those reactions say about your values, boundaries, or even your levels of stress? And if you feel like sharing, I'd love to hear from you. You can send your thoughts or questions to me at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Now let's settle in and explore the psychology of irritation. By the end of this episode, I hope you'll not only have a deeper understanding of why people annoy us, but also a few tools to navigate those moments with a little more grace and insight. Let's get started. Let's begin by defining irritation. At its core, irritation is a low-grade emotional response. It's not as intense as anger or frustration, but it can feel just as pervasive. Think of it as a nagging discomfort, a small crack in the glass that draws your focus, even when you try to ignore it. Psychologically speaking, irritation often arises when our expectations are unmet, or when something feels out of alignment with our preferences, values, or boundaries. It's that subtle friction between what we want or need and what we're experiencing. Sometimes irritation stems from what I like to call microaggressions of everyday life. Now, I'm not referring to the sociopolitical concept of microaggressions here, but rather those seemingly harmless everyday behaviors that slowly build into irritants. It might be someone repeatedly tapping their pen during a meeting, a driver who doesn't signal before changing lanes, or that one coworker who leaves their coffee mug in the sink instead of rinsing it out. These small cumulative annoyances might not matter much on their own, but when they pile up, they can feel impossible to ignore. Now, let's dig a little deeper into the psychological and biological roots of irritation. From a neurological perspective, irritation is closely tied to our stress response system, The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for processing emotions, plays a key role here. When something irritates us, the amygdala sends out a signal that something in our environment isn't quite right. This triggers a mild activation of our fight or flight system, even if there's no real danger present. It's our brain's way of saying, pay attention. This might be important. This response also has its roots in evolutionary psychology. You see, for early humans, noticing irritants in their environment could mean the difference between life and death. A dripping sound in the distance could signal a leaking shelter. A repetitive noise might indicate a predator nearby. Our brains evolved to be hyper-attuned to small disruptions. And while most of us no longer face predators or leaky caves, those ancient survival mechanisms are still at play. But why are some people more irritated by certain things than others? The answer lies in the individual nature of irritation. What annoys us is shaped by a combination of personal values, past experiences, and our own temperament. For instance, someone who values punctuality might feel irritated when a friend shows up late, while someone more laid back might not even think twice about it. Similarly, if you've grown up in a noisy household, you might be less bothered by loud environments than someone who's used to peace and quiet. I'll share a personal story here to illustrate this point. When I was a young professor, I had a habit of organizing my desk meticulously. Each paper, pen, and book had its place. I had a colleague who loved to stop by my office, and while they were always kind and engaging, they had this tendency to fidget with whatever was on my desk, rearranging my papers, picking up pens, and so on. It drove me up the wall. It wasn't until I reflected on why this bothered me that I realized it wasn't about the fidgeting itself. It was about control. My meticulously organized desk was my way of creating order in a busy, often chaotic world. Their behavior felt like a disruption to that order. Understanding this allowed me to manage my irritation more effectively and even share a laugh with my colleague about it later. So the next time you feel irritated, take a moment to reflect. What does this feeling reveal about you? Are there underlying values, past experiences, or personality traits at play? You see, recognizing these patterns is the first step toward not only managing your irritation, but using it as a tool for self-awareness and growth. Let's dive into some common sources of irritation, starting with the behaviors that can make our skin crawl or send us into a slow simmer of frustration. These are the everyday annoyances we encounter, like someone chewing loudly, interrupting us in mid-thought, or offering an overly detailed explanation when a simple answer would have sufficed. So why do these behaviors bother us so much? From a psychological perspective, they often clash with our fundamental needs for control, order, or attention. For instance, loud chewing, what some might refer to as misophonia, violates our need for a sense of peace and predictability in our environment. When someone interrupts us, it's not just about the disruption, it's about feeling dismissed or undervalued, which can trigger a defensive emotional response. And over-explaining, that often grates because it feels like the other person assumes we're incapable of understanding on our own, challenging our need for autonomy. But behavioral annoyances are just one piece of the puzzle. Let's talk about personality clashes. This is where things get interesting because it's not about a specific behavior, but the way our personality interacts with someone else's. Psychology gives us a great framework to understand this in the form of the big 5 personality traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Each of these traits can be a source of friction depending on the dynamic. Take extroversion, for example. An extroverted person might thrive on social interaction and spontaneous conversation, while someone more introverted might find that same energy overwhelming or even irritating. Similarly, a highly conscientious individual might be irritated by someone they perceive as disorganized or careless, while the reverse might see that meticulousness as overbearing or nitpicky. There's also an important psychological concept at play here: projection. Sometimes the things that irritate us most in others reflect something we dislike or even fear about ourselves. If you've ever found yourself annoyed by someone's constant need for validation, it might be worth asking if there's a part of you that struggles with self-assurance. It's not an easy realization, but it's one that can be profoundly enlightening. Of course, irritation isn't always about the person in front of us. Environmental factors play a significant role too. Noise, crowds, and fatigue are classic examples of external stressors that can amplify our irritability. Picture this. You're stuck in a traffic jam after a long day. The radio is blaring ads, and someone in the car next to you is yelling into their phone. Under normal circumstances, you might brush off one or two of these things, but combined, they can feel unbearable. That's because our mental bandwidth is finite. When we're tired, overstimulated, or already stressed, we have less capacity to tolerate additional irritants. This ties into the psychological phenomenon of sensory overload. Our brains are constantly processing input from the world around us, and when that input exceeds what we can comfortably handle, it manifests as frustration or irritation. It's why you might snap at a loved one after a day of nonstop meetings, or find yourself unusually annoyed by minor inconveniences when you're running on a little sleep at all. Recognizing these sources, behavioral annoyances, personality clashes, and environmental factors can help us take a step back and evaluate our reactions more thoughtfully. Instead of immediately blaming the person or situation, we can ask ourselves what's really going on here. Often, irritation isn't just about the trigger itself, but about deeper layers of unmet needs, insecurities, or external stressors that deserve our attention. Irritation might seem like a small everyday nuisance, but it's much more significant than we often realize. In fact, irritation can serve as an important signal, one we should learn to listen to rather than ignore. Let's start by framing irritation as an emotional cue. Think of it as your mind's way of tapping you on the shoulder and saying, "Hey, something here isn't right." It's not always about the loud chewing or the interrupted conversation. It's often about what those moments reveal beneath the surface. Psychologically, irritation often highlights unmet needs, values, or boundaries. For instance, if you feel irritated when someone cuts you off mid-sentence, it might point to a deeper need to feel heard or respected. If you bristle at a colleague's last-minute requests, it might reflect your value for planning and structure, or perhaps a boundary you haven't fully articulated yet. In this way, irritation isn't just a nuisance, it's a mirror showing us areas where our inner world and outer experiences are misaligned. But irritation isn't just personal, it plays a fascinating role in our social interactions too. Expressing or addressing irritation can actually help maintain healthy group dynamics. Let me give you an example. In a workplace setting, imagine a team where one member consistently misses deadlines. Over time, this behavior starts to irritate their colleagues. If left unaddressed, that irritation can fester, creating resentment and ultimately damaging the team's cohesion. However, if someone tactfully raises the issue, perhaps by saying, "I've noticed we've been struggling to meet our deadlines, and I think it's important we all stay on track," that moment of irritation becomes a catalyst for positive change. Let's look at a case study to illustrate this further. There was a study conducted in the context of romantic relationships that found irritation can actually strengthen bonds when handled constructively. Partners who expressed mild irritation in the form of I statements like, "I feel frustrated when the dishes pile up because I value a clean space," they were more likely to resolve conflicts and feel closer afterward. On the flip side, when irritation was expressed harshly or suppressed altogether, it often led to larger conflicts or emotional distance. This demonstrates how irritation, when managed thoughtfully, can be a tool for better communication and stronger connections. Of course, there's a flip side to all of this: the risks of unchecked irritation. When we don't address the things that irritate us, either by ignoring them or letting them build up, they can lead to chronic stress. Imagine constantly brushing off small annoyances at work, in your relationships, or in your daily routine. Over time, these seemingly minor frustrations accumulate, creating a backdrop of tension that drains your energy and patience. This can contribute to burnout, a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion, often fueled by unaddressed stressors. Now, unchecked irritation can harm our relationships. When irritation goes unexpressed, it often leaks out in unhealthy ways through passive-aggressive comments, outbursts, or withdrawal, the silent treatment. These behaviors can confuse or alienate others, creating a cycle where the original issue remains unresolved and the relationship begins to suffer by the unconscious behaviors as a result of that lack of resolution. So why does irritation matter? Because it's a signal, a social tool, and a potential stressor all rolled into one. When we learn to recognize and address our irritation, whether by reflecting on our unmet needs, communicating thoughtfully, or setting healthier boundaries, we're not just managing a fleeting emotion. We're engaging in self-awareness, strengthening our relationships, and protecting our mental health. It's one of those small but very profound ways we can grow as individuals and as members of a broader community. So let's talk now about strategies for managing irritation, because while irritation is a natural part of life, it doesn't have to control us. By developing self-awareness, improving communication, and building tolerance, we can navigate these moments with greater ease and emotional intelligence. The first step, of course, is self-awareness and mindfulness. Recognizing your triggers is key to managing irritation effectively. Ask yourself, what's really bothering me right now? Is it the loud chewing, or is it the stress from your day amplifying the sound? Is it the interruption, or are you feeling undervalued in a broader sense? Pausing to reflect before reacting can give you the clarity you need to respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively. Mindfulness practices can be especially helpful here. Something as simple as taking a deep breath or silently counting to 5 can create the space you need to evaluate your emotions. Cognitive reframing is another powerful tool. This involves interpreting annoying behaviors in a different light. For example, if someone is over-explaining something, consider the possibility that they're nervous or trying to be helpful, rather than assuming that they think you're incapable. Reframing situations this way doesn't excuse behavior, but it does help soften your emotional response and reduce the likelihood of unnecessary conflict. Next, let's talk about communication and boundaries. One of the most effective ways to prevent irritation from festering is by assertively communicating your needs. Assertiveness doesn't mean being confrontational. It means expressing yourself clearly and respectfully. For instance, instead of saying, "You always interrupt me," you might say, "I feel frustrated when I'm interrupted because it makes it harder for me to express my thoughts. Can we try to avoid that in the future?" This approach focuses on your feelings and the behavior, not on the person, which makes it less likely to trigger defensiveness. Timing and tone are crucial here. Addressing irritation in the heat of the moment often leads to escalation. Instead, wait until you're calm. Then approach the conversation with empathy. Imagine you're dealing with a coworker who frequently talks over you in meetings. Rather than confronting them publicly in frustration, you might pull them aside afterward and say, "I really value your input, and I'd like to make sure my ideas are heard too. Can we work on balancing our contributions?" This kind of approach shows respect while still setting a clear boundary. Finally, let's explore building tolerance. While it's important to address irritants, it's equally important to build your capacity to tolerate life's minor frustrations. Empathy is a great place to start. When someone's behavior annoys you, try stepping into their shoes. Ask yourself, what might they be experiencing that's causing this behavior? If a friend is overly critical, for instance, they might be dealing with their own insecurities. Understanding this doesn't mean you have to tolerate harmful behavior indefinitely, but it can help you respond with more compassion in the moment. There are practical tools for increasing frustration tolerance. Deep breathing is a classic technique that works wonders. When you feel irritation creeping in, take a slow, deep breath. Hold it for a few seconds, and then exhale slowly. This activates your parasympathetic nervous system, which helps calm your body's stress response. Humor can also be surprisingly effective. If you can find something amusing about the situation, even if it's just how absurdly small the annoyance is, it can break the tension and shift your perspective. Another technique is gradual exposure. If you know certain things tend to irritate you, consider exposing yourself to them in controlled doses. For example, if you're easily irritated by noise, try spending small amounts of time in busier environments while practicing relaxation techniques. Over time, this can help desensitize you to the trigger and increase your tolerance. Managing irritation isn't about eliminating it entirely. That's impossible. Instead, it's about understanding it, responding to it with intention, and using it as an opportunity for growth. With practice, you'll find that those small annoyances lose their power to disrupt your peace, leaving you more grounded and resilient in the face of life's challenges. As we wrap up today's episode, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've covered. Irritation, as we've explored, is far more than just an inconvenience. It's a valuable emotional signal, one that reveals unmet needs, boundaries, and values. Whether it's triggered by behavioral quirks, personality differences, or environmental stressors, irritation has something to teach us if we're willing to listen. We've also talked about practical ways to manage irritation, from cultivating self-awareness and practicing mindfulness to setting clear boundaries and building tolerance. There are tools we can use to navigate these moments more gracefully. At its core, learning to manage irritation isn't just about reducing discomfort, it's about fostering healthier relationships with ourselves and others, and creating a more harmonious life. Now, I want to leave you with a question to reflect on. What do your moments of irritation say about you? Are they pointing to a need for better communication, a boundary that needs reinforcing, or perhaps an opportunity to practice empathy? Take some time this week to notice your triggers and consider what they might reveal.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.